This amendment, so this relates to Clause 7, and the amendment omits the allowance that voluntary assisted dying may be raised in the context of advising on palliative care. This particular amendment will align the Act with the position in South Australia and Victoria and New Zealand. Western Australia, I understand, has a similar approach to that proposed by this bill before the House. This really is one of the first clauses that goes to that question of coercion, and I noted Frank Brennan wrote about this in The Australian again this morning in an op-ed, and I may not agree with Frank Brennan on everything, but he raised concerns in particular about amendments to this Clause 7 that are starkly in contrast to the position taken in Victoria in respect of the ability to initiate discussions. And I thought that was a very telling article on this. The Royal Australian College of Physicians states, and I'll quote for them, that the provision has the potential for coercion and misuse of power. Safeguards against coercion within the bill must closely oversee and monitor those cases where a medical practitioner initiates a discussion of or suggests voluntary assisted dying. So this is one of the first amendments that goes towards that question of coercion, that risk of coercion, and that is why it has been put forward for consideration during consideration in detail.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the member for Nanango.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just would like to start by saying it has been a very considered debate, and as many members on both sides of the House have said, it's been a very difficult debate. But I think our goal in everything is to make sure we get this right, and that's what I certainly said in my speech. But in relation to this clause, I do feel the need to speak to the amending clause by the member for Toowoomba South, because it goes to the heart of one of the biggest issues I have had with this bill, and that's in relation to coercion. We know it is a difficult issue. We know that there is a great extra need for palliative care, and that has been said. But to go to the point of amending this clause, it actually has been considered by other jurisdictions, and I take on board the comments that have been said by the other member just before in relation to consideration of the amendments of the member for Toowoomba South. This amendment has been considered by other jurisdictions. It's being used by other jurisdictions. It's being used in South Australia, Victoria and New Zealand, and that is all around not commencing, initiating, putting to a patient that this is available. The Health Minister has just said that the people that access VAD in Victoria are highly paid, they're educated, they're the people. So this clause is talking about initiating discussion with people which can only go to coercion. It can only go to, unfortunately, an aspect of elder abuse, which is something that I'm deeply concerned about and is a rising issue within our society. This is a clause that has been, I'll say it again, has been considered by other jurisdictions, New Zealand, Victoria, South Australia, and I would plead with this House to follow suit.
Before calling next member, I just wish to ensure that members, whilst the Deputy Premier has carriage of the bill, the Deputy Premier is not the Minister for Health. And no, that's okay, member, but just important in terms of preciseness for Hansard, ensuring that we do continue to get that right throughout the remainder of consideration in detail. I call the member for Logan.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. To some extent, I feel like I have to explain to the LNP, while I support this amendment, I have to explain some of the nature of what it is. And I think this is important that we look at the whole Section 7, healthcare workers not to initiate voluntary assisted dying. The report made it really clear that that they identified that the patient themselves should be the one to first identify that they wish to seek voluntary assisted dying. We've heard really powerfully from the member for Greenslopes and from other practitioners how often people who are in pain and despair and existential despair about dying will bring up these issues of wanting to die, which provides many openings for discussion. But the report by the QLRC and many others identified that healthcare workers should not initiate a discussion about voluntary assisted dying, and that's what the Section 1 of this does. It states clearly a healthcare worker must not, in the course of providing a healthcare service, initiate discussion with the person that is in substance about voluntary dying, or in substance suggest assisted voluntary dying to a person. So it's relatively clear what Section 1 means, and it provides those safeguards that were intended, that the person themselves is at the centre of the care and the person nominating it. However, I think that Section 2 goes against the spirit of what they're suggesting. This doesn't reach the level of coercion, as some would suggest, but it is very powerful when the person who administers your care brings up issues. And the message intended, especially when initiated by that person, may be different from the message that is actually received by the patient. So Section 2 says that, however, they can, in substance, suggest voluntary dying to the person if they've also brought up treatment options and palliative care treatment options. Now, what we don't know is whether the patient receives these in a completely balanced way, we hope. But given that we have put in Section 1 to ensure there are safeguards of this happening because we fear that there will be no presentation of it whatsoever, could we also not fear that there is not a balance between the presentation of treatment options or palliative care options? Further, and the member for Greenslopes raised these issues about other provisions that are quite prescriptive on healthcare doctors and nurses, that isn't there some safety that complaints against healthcare nurses, and I really wish to make that this is centred on the patient, but also for the healthcare workers, if they had the safety of being able to nominate that the patient themselves had raised voluntary assisted dying first, that would give them that safeguard.
The member's time has expired.
Mr Speaker.
I call the member for Moggle.
Mr Speaker, I rise in support of these amendments, and as has been said, this really goes to the heart of coercion. And firstly, can I say or declare that I am a Fellow of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, Chapter of Addiction Medicine, and the reason that I just put that on the record is that the submission by the Royal Australasian College of Physicians is the basis for this amendment and can be justified for the following reasons. Firstly, as the member for Nanango has said, it would align the legislation in Queensland with that of other state jurisdictions around Australia, including Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, but as well as New Zealand, by omitting the provision for voluntary assisted dying to be raised in the context of advising on palliative care. And it's important to realise that in relation to other jurisdictions, including Victoria, they do not allow a registered health practitioner to initiate a discussion about voluntary assisted dying with a patient or resident whom they are providing health or professional services to. So the first reason is to align with other jurisdictions. Secondly, it aims to avoid the potential for coercion and misuse of power by medical practitioners. And thirdly, it's always been my view, Mr Speaker, that self-regulation of the medical profession is not in the best interest of the public, and that there needs to be strong and rigorous checks and balances and oversight, and nowhere would this be more important than when initiating a discussion and conversation about voluntary assisted dying. Mr Speaker, there have been instances where treating medical practitioners have been the direct beneficiaries from patients they've been treated, and whilst there are provisions in the legislation that specifically deal with conflicts of interest, there can be some highly questionable and unethical and convoluted strategies that some people have gone to either benefit from wills or direct sort of financial benefits, and there can be also subtle influences. Now, whilst this is not in line with the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency or codes of conduct under the Australian Medical Council or the Medical Board of Australia or other professional bodies, it is important that we do have these rigorous checks and balances. And so this amendment could further serve to strengthen the legislation to ensure there's no potential for coercion or misuse of power resulting in pecuniary benefit, and whether that be for medical practitioners, whether it be for other health service providers, or health carers, and therefore I believe that this amendment is important. It's absolutely worth considering, because the last thing that we would want is either direct or indirect influence, subtle influence, and/or people to be the beneficiaries of some of this. So it's an important amendment to protect against coercion.
I call the member for Toowoomba North.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to support this amendment. And as stated by the Royal College of Physicians, it has potential for coercion and misuse of a power in the context that it's put in this bill. And it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but unfortunately some doctors may use their power to steer patients in the direction of assisted suicide or euthanasia. This bill allows a doctor to use their enormous influence over a patient by actually raising the possibility of assisted suicide with the patient. We know that older patients, sick with terminal illness, put enormous weight on their doctor's advice. So this is a recipe for undue influence, and I believe it should be removed as per the amendment. We know that it doesn't exist in other jurisdictions, and we know that it's prohibited for a doctor or a nurse to raise VAD with a patient in Victoria, South Australia or New Zealand. So we're not asking for anything too extreme here. We're just asking for a check and balance on the power of a doctor that even unconsciously may have over their patient by initiating this conversation. Frank Varghese and Brian Kelly, professors wrote in the Journal of Psychiatry Services, much of the debate about euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide has at its underlying assumption that doctors will always act in the interest of their patients. This assumption fails to take into account the doctor's unconscious and indeed sometimes conscious wishes for the patient to die, and thereby to relieve everyone, including the doctor, of distress. Legislation to enable assisted suicide has been designed to provide a safeguard through the psychiatric assessment that protects the patient from themselves. What these laws do not do and cannot do is protect the patient against unconscious factors in the doctor's mind. So I think it's very important that we remove this potential abuse and that we provide an opportunity for a doctor to have a discussion about palliation and not raise the potential of VAD. Now, if the patient raises that, then that's the patient's choice, but it shouldn't be the doctor's choice for the patient. That is getting things round the wrong way, Mr Speaker.
I call the member for Scenic River.
Yes, thanks, Mr Speaker.